All right, so I said in the slide that we were just on that I was going to show you an example of how to make a frequency distribution. And a frequency distribution, as I said, involves listing all possible observations for a variable and listing the number of observations for each. So to go through an example of this, I'm going to come up with some data for us to use. And we'll say that the data we're looking at is the number of felony arrests that 12 people have had. So we'll say number of felony arrests. And so each of these numbers is going to be the number of arrests that one person has in our sample. So one person has 2 arrests, one person has 1 arrest, one person has no arrests, one person has no arrests, and so on. So I'll just keep writing out these numbers. And again, each of these numbers is going to be the number of felony arrests that each person in our sample has. And so if you look at that, there are 12 numbers total. So those would be 12 people in our sample who all have different numbers of felony arrests. So this makes felony arrests a variable. It's something that varies among the different people in our sample and that we can put a number to. So if I want to create a frequency distribution, I'm going to follow 2 steps. The first step, I said, is going to be to list out all the observations that we have here. So step 1, we're going to list out all these different observations. And if you remember from last time, an observation is a value that a variable takes on within your sample. So for this case here, this person has 2 arrests, the observation is 2. For this person here, this person had 1 arrest, so that observation would be 1, and so on. So I'm going to list out all the different observations that we have. And if you look through this list of numbers, you can see that we have some people with 0 arrests, some people with 1 arrest, some people with 2 arrests, someone with 3 arrests, and some people with 4 arrests. So that's our first step. We've listed out all the different values that this variable takes on in our sample. And note that I listed them in order from least to most, and this is generally how you're going to want to do these. All right, so step 2. Step 2 here is going to be to list the number of observations for each of these. In other words, how many people in our sample had each of these observations that we're looking at. And to do this, we're just going to count up the numbers that we see. So our first question is, how many people in our sample had 0 prior arrests? Well, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. That means that the first number in our column here is going to be a 4. How many people had 1 arrest? Well, we've got 1, 2, 3 people with 1 prior arrest. How many people had 2 arrests? Well, we're going to keep counting. 1, 2. If you look, we have only 1 person with 3 arrests, so we'll put a 1 next to our 3 here. And then we had 2 people with 4 arrests finally. And we didn't have anybody with 5 or more arrests. So here we've done the bulk of the work. What we're going to do next is just relabel it into something that will tell us a little bit more specifically what we're looking at. So these are our steps, and I'm going to change the labels that we have on top. So instead of saying step 1 and step 2, I'm going to say our first column is the number of arrests, because that's what we're listing out. And the number of arrests that we can have are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, this just corresponds to our first step here. Our other column, we're going to call frequency, or F. And this column shows us the number of times that each of these different values appear in our data. So I'm going to take what we wrote for step 2 here, where we counted up all the times each number appeared, and write this in our frequency column. We have 4, 3, 2, 1, and 2. And finally, I'm going to add up the total, which tells us the total number of observations we had in the sample, which, as we said before, was 12. And you could get this number 12 in 2 ways. You could either count up the number of observations that we have here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or you could add up the numbers that we have in this frequency column here. So 4 plus 3 is 7, plus 2 is 9, plus 1 is 10, plus 2 is 12. And so you can always get it in those two ways. And that's it. We're done. We've created a frequency distribution for number of arrests. As I mentioned though, you can do this for variables at different levels of measurement, so I'm also going to go through an example of a frequency distribution using a ordinal level variable. So here we're going to say that there are different sentence types, and they range in severity from least severe to most severe. And so in this sample here, so this is going to be a different sample, different number of observations, we're going to have somebody who went to prison, somebody who went to jail, somebody who went to prison, somebody who got probation, somebody who got a fine, somebody who went to jail, and so on. Okay. Probation, fine, jail, fine, probation. So what we have here is a sample with 8 people in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And each of them got a different sentence. Now we can say that this is an ordinal level variable because we know that a fine is less severe than probation, which is less severe than jail, which is less severe than prison. But we can't do any arithmetic with it. So what's prison plus jail? Nothing. So we have an ordinal level variable here. In order to create a frequency distribution, we're going to follow those 2 steps again. And the first step is going to be to list out the different observations that we have. And for this, I'm going to skip right to this format here, since this is the format that we want to use. So in my first column, for step 1, where I list out the possible observations that I have, I'm going to list out different sentences, where the possible sentences that we have are a fine, jail, oh, not in that order. The different sentences that we have are a fine, probation, jail, and prison. And I'll just put total down here since we'll be using that later. So that was step 1. We've listed out the different observations that we can see in our sample. Step 2 will be to count out the frequency with which each of these different possible sentences appears in our data. So we'll label our second column frequency, which we can also call F, and then count up the number of times we see these different observations. So how many times do we see a fine in this sample? 1, 2. How many times do we see probation in this sample? 1, 2. How many times do we see jail in this sample? 1, 2. And then finally, how many times do we see prison in this sample? 1, 2. So in this case, we have the same frequency for each of these observations, and we would show it in the table like this. We can also add the total to our frequency table, and our total here is going to be 8. Again, you could find that either by counting up the number of observations you have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or by adding up all the numbers in this column. So you have 4 2s, and that gives you 8. One other thing, the total number we can also call n. And I'll put that over here for this one. So your total, or n, is going to be equal to 12, or your total, or n, is going to be equal to 8. And normally it would be on this side, but this is just to show you that that's what this is here.